Perhaps the biggest prejudice placed against God of all is the false belief that God approved the usage of slavery. Now, this is an easy prejudice to debunk, and in this video I'll provide about 3 different reasons as to why this is clearly untrue. Now, first I want to look at scripture and a few quotes that God himself stated that go to show how God perceived those of the lower class. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 15, verses 7 and 8, God states, "If anyone is poor among your fellow Israelites in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need." In the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 10, God goes on to state, "Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner." So in these first 2 quotes, what we can see is that God is encouraging his followers to take care of those in the lower class of their communities. In the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18, God goes on to say, "You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself." So from these 3 quotes, we can see that God is encouraging the community to take care of one another, to care for each other. And if God says to love your neighbor as yourself, well then a slave owner isn't going to treat a slave as themselves. It's a natural contradiction in his own writing to believe that God would say that, but then approve of the usage of slavery. So clearly from God's own words, he does not approve of oppression or the usage of slaves. Now, the second main point that must be understood is that the word slave in the modern Bible is a misunderstanding, misrepresentation of the words that God actually used. Now, first, to understand this, we must recognize that the word slave was actually invented in around the year 1300. So the word slave wasn't the original word that was used in the Bible. That word, that translation comes from the word, I may mispronounce this, Eved. Now just a simple Google search of the word Eved shows that it has different contexts and different meanings than the word that we use today, slave. Now we see this in all types of translations from language. For instance, the Spanish usage of the word love is much different than the English word for love. They have different uses and different forms of the word love in Spanish than we do in English. And this difference in context, for instance, if you use the word amor in Spanish and you just go applying it to everything, those people who speak Spanish are going to look at you like you're crazy because you're misrepresenting the actual word amor. So when we as Americans or English speakers take the modern understanding of the word slave, which we reference back to the slavery that occurred here in America when the British established slavery in the 13 colonies, and we take that context and apply it to the Bible with a word that was invented well after, thousands of years after, when God had actually directly spoken to Moses, well then we're taking a translated language and then adding an invented word, which creates a massive misrepresentation of what was actually being spoken about at the time. The reality is, social hierarchies and working hierarchies may always exist. There are those who are meant to lead and those who are meant to follow, and that is okay. And what we have to further understand is God did not establish the economy for the Israelites. God gave the Israelites principles and guidance, but God allowed the Israelites to lead and develop their own economy. So this second point is probably the biggest reason why people misrepresent and misunderstand what God was actually saying, because humans, flawed, imperfect humans, have come and translated the original texts, applied new words that are correlated to modern experiences of slavery, and we're using that example to then perceive what God was talking about all those thousands of years ago. Now, this leads to the last point where people will say, well, why did God not explicitly say not to use slaves or slavery was bad? But what people need to understand is that if God were to actually bullet point every single immoral infraction out, well, then that list would be about 200 points long. God wanted to create a fundamental base where all moral behaviors could be derived from, and he did do just that. Now, an argument could be made that there are about 3 different commandments that God directly gave that could encompass that slavery is not good. But the main one is, thou shalt not steal. Well, if you are using somebody else's work and then deriving all the benefits from that work, that is stealing. And so we can debate this back and forth between believers and non-believers, but the reality is God does not approve of slavery. He never has, but he does allow us as humans the free will to lead our lives as we want, but with his principles, if we apply those in honesty, we can get to the reality that slavery is bad, using the work of other people without paying them appropriately is bad. And again, I'll restate in the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, verse 18, when God asks us to love our fellow man as ourself, clearly a slave owner would not love their slave as much as themselves. Otherwise, they would immediately relinquish them from that said slavery.